Hello! This patch is something I came up for part 2 of my upcoming delay deep dive video. But again, the video is really long, so I needed to cut it down. So I'm not going to go through this patch in this video, I'll save that for the next one. But I am going to go through one of the techniques I used to put this patch together, the envelope end out. So the following walkthrough was originally part of the second delay deep dive video, which will be coming pretty soon, but this section I think can stand on its own, so I'm going to release it separately. So this video is about the envelope end of cycle outs on the Matriarch. I'll do a quick walkthrough of how they work and then put together a nice simple percussive patch at the end. As always, there's an index in the description and links to patch diagrams. So let's get to it. Okay, let me explain how I've got everything set up. Wave out of oscillator 1 is being sent to an attenuator, which is acting as a volume control, and it's patched directly to VCA1 in. It's a saw wave. Oscillator 2 is an octave above oscillator 1, and it's a square wave. I've also got it patched into an attenuator, so volume control again, directly into VCA2 in. The VCA is in drone mode. The filter envelope generator out is patched to the CV control input for VCA1. So the filter envelope generator controls the volume for oscillator 1. The amp envelope generator out is patched into the CV control input for VCA2, so it controls the volume of oscillator 2. And there's oscillator 2. And here's oscillator 1. I've got the filter envelope generator's end of cycle out patched to the trigger input of the amp envelope generator. So when we hear oscillator 2, the higher note, we know the filter envelope generator out is sending a high gate signal. Okay, and I'm using these tip-top mult cables to send the filter envelope out and the filter envelope end out to an oscilloscope. I get asked a lot about the scopes I use. Lately I've been using the free VCV rack scope in most of my videos, and that's what I'm using today. The red trace on the scope is the filter envelope end of cycle out. The yellow trace is the filter envelope out. You can see that the red trace or envelope end out is currently sending a high gate signal. Makes sense because the filter envelope is obviously currently at its low voltage point or end of cycle. So again, if I bring the sustain up on the amp envelope generator, we'll hear oscillator 2. If I raise the sustain on the filter envelope generator, we won't hear anything, at least not yet, because nothing has triggered the filter envelope generator. So let's fix that. If I press a key, the filter envelope generator is triggered, so we hear oscillator 1. The filter envelope is in mid-cycle and with sustain up. As long as I hold a key, we'll hear oscillator 1, but not 2. Now, as soon as I release the key, the end of envelope triggers the amp envelope generator. And you can see this on the scope. It's pretty straight ahead so far. Okay, that's the simplest situation and pretty simple to understand. Remember, the envelope out is a gate signal, so if it's triggering something that responds to gate signals, like in this case an envelope generator, and if there's a sustain value higher than 0, then the mod destination will remain open when the envelope end has finished its cycle. And that's clearly visible on the scope right now. The red trace is high. We're just not hearing oscillator 2 because I turned sustain to 0, so I don't need to talk over it for the moment. Okay, let's just change up the values on this envelope generator. So the most common use for end of cycle outs is to trigger another voice after the first. I guess we did that already, but let's try that with a little bit more musical ADR envelope instead of ADSR. Okay, but let's turn sustain off on the filter envelope and just go with the 3-stage ADR. Okay, with sustain off, it doesn't matter if I'm still holding the key. As soon as the envelope ends, it triggers our second envelope generator. So far I think it's pretty easy to understand what's going on. Nothing's really that tricky so far. But let's see what happens if we alter the attack of the filter envelope generator. Okay, you can see the red trace is staying high. So the gate signal from the envelope end out stays open until the attack reaches its high value. To demonstrate, let's turn sustain back up on the amp envelope generator. So with a long attack like this, it's just staying open. I'll make the attack a bit longer. It's pretty obvious what's happening. Let's add sustain to our filter envelope. Aha, the gate is closed. So that's pretty important to remember. Envelope end out is exactly what it says. A high gate output until the end of the envelope, not the beginning to the end. So with 0 decay, sustain, or release, there is no end, so it's always going to stay open. So let's play with some standard envelope shapes and put this to the test. Okay, cool. So you can see all 4 stages of our envelope pretty clearly now. But look at that high red trace there. It stayed through right until the attack got to the high point. So let's raise the sustain on the amp envelope and check this out. Okay, I hope that's clear. The envelope end out stays open until attack reaches its high point. I keep saying open. What I mean to say is the gate signal is high. Okay, but let's move on to some trickier concepts. So what's going to happen if I play a second note before the envelope cycle of the first note has ended? Okay, so you heard it. The amp envelope generator was triggered even though the filter envelope hadn't completed its cycle. That's because on the matriarch, the attack is triggered every time the envelope generator receives a trigger, regardless of its position in the envelope cycle. This goes back to what we saw earlier. The envelope end out sends a high gate signal only after the attack phase has reached its highest point. So if I turn attack back to 0, the filter envelope generator goes to its highest value immediately, so it shouldn't trigger the amp envelope generator. Okay, that worked. There was no overlap that time. I should play a bit slower. Okay, so it's pretty clear now. There's no overlap like we were getting when we had high attack values. This is easier to hear with them both on full sustain. Okay, let's bring the attack back up on our filter envelope generator and listen for the overlap. So when I hit a key, it's triggering the amp envelope generator. And it's going to do it again, there, if I let the envelope finish its cycle. Now with attack at 0, and if I play lots of notes before the envelope ends, it's obviously not going to trigger the second envelope generator. Until the cycle ends, of course. So an important thing to remember is that the attack value has an unusual effect on the end of cycle out on the matriarch. It's easy enough to understand with slow notes spaced out, but as soon as things get a little busier, it gets a little trickier to predict. But hopefully now you have a better understanding. So to demonstrate sort of more real-life situations, I'm going to patch a gate signal. I'll just use an LFO. So it's the blue trace on the scope, and I'm going to use it to trigger the filter envelope generator. And I'm going to initialize both the envelope generators. Okay, let's bring sustain up on both. Okay, again, easy to understand. It's behaving the exact same way it was with the key press, so no big deal so far. Okay, let's turn up decay on the filter envelope generator. Okay, pretty much no difference. You can see a tiny little bump on the yellow trace, but what's actually happening is the decay stage is so long, it's basically approximating sustain. So if I bring the sustain down, it becomes a little easier to see. Okay, let's bring the decay down to a short decay and bring sustain up to medium and try to make both stages pretty clear. That's good. There we go. Now you can clearly see the decay and sustain stages. And with 0 release, the end of cycle happens at the end of the gate. So now let's add some release. Oh, that might be a bit long. There. Okay, the release stage of the envelope happens after the gate is low. So the envelope end out doesn't send a high gate signal until all 4 envelope stages are complete. So release is dependent on sustain and decay, so if we take sustain off, we're going to have a longer open gate signal. But check this out. Watch what happens if I raise the release value. Isn't that neat? So the release is triggering the envelope out. It's kind of acting as a second phase of our envelope. It's not supposed to do that, but it does. So what this means is the decay stage of the envelope is hitting 0 before a release is triggered. So we're getting that little blip, as you can see it. And it's kind of almost random at times. Now we can get rid of that by just raising up our sustain if you don't want that. But you can still hear the little blip, but it's not triggering the end of envelope out this time. Okay, let's look at attack again. So again, we're getting our overlap. The envelope end out gate stays open until attack reaches its highest point. So if I turn the release on our filter envelope generator up, so it's really long value, long enough that the attack is triggered before the release ends, well, you can see what happens. So now the envelope end out is essentially just outputting the attack phase of our filter envelope generator. Pretty cool. Okay, now if I put sustain on the filter envelope back to 0, there we go. So now we're going to get a long and short note, one that's the length of the attack, and one that's triggered after the release stage. Now, if attack and release are both long, we're only going to get the attack stage. And if we turn release off and stick with a long attack, the envelope end out will basically stay open because we never get to the high value of the attack. And we can kind of use that as our own makeshift attenuator if you want. But it's not really helping us with our envelope end out at all. Now let me show you one more. This one's my favorite. With the attack at a medium length and a really long release, watch what happens. So isn't that cool? So it looks like the attack stage is continuing, even though it hasn't been completed, but being interrupted by the release phase. And of course, we're getting some interesting rhythms from our end of cycle out too. Neat. Okay, so I hope that gives you a better idea of how the envelope end out and the envelope generators in general work on the Moog Matriarch. So now it's time to experiment and see what you can come up with. I wasn't going to do a patch in this video, but you know what? I might as well show you one of the most common uses for all of this stuff. Let's make a percussion patch. Actually, before we try a patch, let's just look at the absolutely most common way to use an envelope end of cycle out. And that's to create a unipolar LFO, or looping envelope. So again, going to use some mult cables so we can plug this into a scope. And I'll patch the envelope out into the VCA CV input. Get this out of the way. Okay, grab another cable and patching out of the end of cycle input to the trigger input on our envelope generator. And that's all we need to do. We now have an LFO. So the attack time and release time are going to control the time and shape of our LFO. Decay and sustain will have no effect when our envelope's looping like this. So as you can see, we're getting kind of a shark tooth LFO, kind of a skewed triangle. I don't know what you want to call it. If the attack and release are... Actually, that's not entirely true. The Matriarch's release is a lot longer than the attack. So if you want it to be kind of close to a triangle, the release has to be shorter than the attack. Let's dial in some different shapes. If we put the attack really low and release long, we'll get a saw type LFO. Actually, let's put the release rate to 0 so you can see that. Cool. And then that means release time is going to control the shape, but also their speed. Let's get some filter envelope modulation happening, just so we're modulating the VCA and the filter with our makeshift LFO. Cool. So that's really all there is to it. If you're in a bind and you've used up all your LFOs and you want something, another mod source, you can loop an envelope generator. Okay, this will also work in a pinch as a VCO. Well, sort of. It will be an oscillator at audio rate, but we're not going to have any voltage control or pitch tracking because there's no CV controls for any of the attack or release on the envelope generators, which has always been my biggest complaint about the Matriarch. But let's see, compare it to this oscillator and figure out, yep, so we got an A flat, kind of. It's a little bit out of tune, but it's an A flat. Let's get rid of the filter modulation so we can hear our envelope oscillator a little clearer. And little tiny movements are going to change the pitch, as you'll see. What are we getting now, an F? No, F sharp. Oh, and big jump just from that tiny little movement. So it's not the most user-friendly oscillator, but with patience you can get it in tune. And if you're in a bind, you've got two extra oscillators on the Matriarch. Cool. So that does that. Let's get on to the patch. Okay, like I said, probably the most common use for envelope end outs is to create patches with some sort of interaction between two different voices. And the simplest probably would be a simple kick and snare groove. So let's put one together. So I'm going to start with the filter, and I'm going to switch it over into a high pass, low pass series mode. But I'm not going to use the filter in series. I'm going to use it as two individual filters, one for the kick and one for the snare. So I'm going to patch the noise out of the mod bay into the filter input for channel 1, and I'm going to patch wave out of oscillator 1 into filter input 2, and I'm going to switch that down to a triangle wave. And I'm only going to use one oscillator, so I'm just making sure oscillators 2, 3, and 4 are off in the mixer. And I'm going to patch out of filter 1, which is a high pass filter, into the VCA input for channel 2. I'm using VCA channel 2 for the hi-hat and 1 for the kick, just so it's the same as the demo we just did. And I'll flip open the VCA. This is just so I can hear what's going on, so I can dial in the sounds. I'm using a dead patch in the VCA 2 to get rid of the hi-hat for now, and just dialing in filter cutoff for kick drum. Oh, I don't really need the dead patch in this case. And I'll use spacing to find the cutoff for the snare drum. I'll add some resonance as well. Obviously not very snare drum yet, but that'll be taken care of once we get the envelope generators going. Okay, good enough start for the sounds for now. And I'm going to grab one of those tip-top mults again so that we can look at this on the scope. So patching envelope out into the scope and into the CV in for channel 1. So the filter envelope will control the volume of the kick drum. And another tip-top mult, and we're going to go envelope end out into the trigger input of the amp envelope generator, just like in the tutorial or walkthrough we just did. Oh, and I've got to patch the amp envelope generator out into the CV input for VCA2. Okay, we need some sort of a clock or gate source, so I'm just going to use the LFO, just like I did in the walkthrough a second ago. It's a pulse LFO. And actually I'm going to wait, but that will be used to trigger the filter envelope generator. And you know what? I'm going to mult the output of the envelope generator. So patching the scope into the mult and out of the filter envelope generator into the mult. And I'm going to patch out of the mult into the brain freeze, into the CV input for filter channel 2, which is the low pass filter, which is modulating our kick drum. Okay, now I'll plug the LFO into the trigger input. Could use a sequencer instead of the LFO, but let's just keep it simple for now. And why aren't we hearing anything? Probably a bad cable or something just not plugged in all the way. That's okay. Hold on a sec. Oh, it's short at this end. There we go. Okay, that was easy. There's our kick and snare. And with these envelope values, it's already in time, so it's great. You know what though? That was too easy. I'm going to just stop that for now. And I'm going to initialize the envelope generators and start from scratch because that was just too lucky. The envelope values were already in a place that we're getting an in-time groove that sounded decent, but what happens if your envelope's in different positions? Anyway, I'm just going to start from scratch so you guys can see how we can put this together. So starting the trigger again, and sustain is up on both envelopes, obviously, with everything else at 0. Okay, so we'll dial in the kick first. We want real short decay, really small movements with both envelope generators. Okay, well, there we go. So it is pretty easy. Just fine-tune them a little bit. A fatter kick. Nice. Okay, it's not the most exciting patch, but that was pretty easy. Let's go a little bit further and just tinker with the sound a bit. I'm going to raise the resonance on the high-pass filter and play with the spacing, which again is related to the cutoff. And try to find a nice balance between our kick and snare. I want a darker snare. That's good. Oh, what was that? A little glitch there. Okay, if I increase the decay and release, I can delay the snare a bit and it can swing a little bit. But I think I'm going to keep it straight for now. But I am going to patch out of the mult, which again is the filter envelope generator, into this attenuator. And out of the attenuator, I'm going to go into the pitch input for VCO1, which is our kick drum again. So we're going to get some VCO modulation. Cool. That sounds good. Let's try an octave lower. Just going down the keyboard. Oh, it's too low. Yeah, it's fine where it is. One of the good things about using a synth for your kick drum is you can tune it to your song. So that's super useful. Just experimenting a little bit more with some envelope times and filter, just doing little small movements here and there to just fine tune it. Yep, sounding good to me. Okay, that walkthrough of the envelope end out I just finished was originally going to be part of my delay deep dive, but the video was getting so long I cut it to make this video, so why don't we use some delay in this patch? So I'm going to take this LFO out of the trigger input and patch it into a mult. I want to sync the delay time to my clock. I could just use the gate out of the arpeggiator or sequencer. If I use that, I could program in some pretty cool rhythms with the sequencer using rests. But let's keep it simple and stick with the LFO as the clock for now. And it gives us a chance to use the delay sync input on the back of the Matriarch. As I remember, it's the third input from the right on the back. Okay, so I'm plugging that into our mult, so our LFO is now clocking our delay. Pretty cool. And lastly, I gotta plug our trigger input back into the mult so we get our groove going. It's getting kind of crowded. And let's turn up the delay. Okay, I don't want the delay to affect the kick, so I'm going to use a dead patch into delay input channel 1. And get rid of the feedback. There. Now our delay is just affecting the snare. And since we've got our delay synced to the LFO, the delay time knob will put out different divisions, so we can try to find some cool snare patterns now. And if I play with the feedback knob, I can get different repeating patterns. Cool. Eighth notes is fine. Now I could just manually turn the feedback knob like I was just doing, but let's figure out a way to do that automatically. Frees up our hands for something else. So I'm going to use the utility LFO for that. But first I'm going to sync the LFO to our other LFO. So rate input into our mult. I can't remember what video I talked about the weird LFO shapes you get when you sync the triangle LFO. But I've got one out there. Anyway, so the output of the triangle LFO, we're going into the feedback input for the delay. And we'll just experiment with the rate of the triangle LFO and see how that affects the feedback. Oh, that's cool. Do some more tinkering with the filter. Okay, not a bad little patch. Again, if I use the sequencer instead of an LFO to clock our kick and snare, we could program in a whole bunch of cool rhythms and get way more complicated. But just wanted to show you the basics of the envelope end out of the envelope generators. And I guess that's what we did. And it's kind of fun playing with the delay to get some more variation in the snare pattern. Now, the icing on the cake for this patch would be to mess around with a little external processing using some pedals or plugins. So, why don't we try that? Okay, didn't really need to go too far. Panned the outputs to the center, used a nice aggressive compressor to add some saturation and level out the dynamics, and have the kick in a side chain that's ducking the reverb on the snare. Pretty fun, simple patch. That'll do it for this one. Next video will be out pretty soon. It'll be part 2 of my delay deep dive. Thanks for watching. Hope you learned something.